After stumbling out of the gate, Roaring Moon is hotter than it's ever been. Having taken multiple top 8 places at recent regional championships, it feels like the community has finally found the secret sauce for Roaring Moon EX. But does it continue that momentum post-rotation? I'm Jet from inthirdperson.com. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and today we are going to do a post-rotation preview with a lot of deck lists and information from Japan. First off though, shoutouts to OmniPoke for putting together this tier list. They have gone through the effort of compiling tournament results from over 60 events in Japan and kind of ranking them based on performance. And as we can see right here, Roaring Moon kind of in the A tier. There are a number of decks above it, but still kind of hanging on and doing well. So maybe it's not in the S tier, or I don't even know if people would consider Roaring Moon currently an S tier deck, but it is still on the upper crust of decks that one can play. Here's another deck list, this one from Book, and they kind of split the A tier a little differently. I think this is based on meta share. I could be wrong on that, but just wanted to emphasize that everything below 10% is in that B tier. And of that B tier, Roaring Moon is on the upper end of that. It does lose some key pieces, including Battle VIP Pass, which is going to make the setup a little more difficult. We're going to be substituting it with more nest balls in order to get our basics down. Galarian Moltres V is actually kind of a bigger loss now that the Ross Cawthorn / the slower Roaring Moon builds have started to take over. Galarian Moltres is great for that Dire Flame's Wings ability and getting that energy and energy switching it off to another attacker in order to keep the deck rolling. So that does kind of suck. And there isn't necessarily a one-to-one substitution for that. And we're also losing Escape Rope, but we do kind of have a better alternative for Escape Rope anyway. Roaring Moon may lose a couple of key pieces to rotation, but I think it ultimately gets better because of some of the big pieces it gains, such as the new Roaring Moon. This is a single prize attacker with 140 HP, and it has the attack Vengeful Feathers, does 70 damage, plus this attack does 10 more damage for each ancient card in your discard pile. The damage is going to stack over time, can make this a very intriguing endgame option, and even at the early game, where if you're doing 70 damage, you're taking out some basic Pokemon like Charmanders and Ralses, and you don't have to put a 2-prize liability in play. So having a good single prize attacker in Roaring Moon is awesome. This Roaring Moon is so good that there are actually decks built with the baby Roaring Moon as the primary attacker. We will not be talking about this type of Roaring Moon archetype in this video. I will save that for a separate video, but you can look and see as an example of how a baby Roaring Moon deck could be built. Prime Catcher appears to be the ace spec of choice for Roaring Moon. Lets you switch your opponent's bench Pokemon into the active, and then you switch one of your bench Pokemon into the active. And this is really great for Roaring Moon in particular, because oftentimes you have Mew EX as a free retreat, and then you can just retreat Mew out and bring in your primary attacker. So essentially, it's an item-based boss's orders, which is fantastic for the deck, allowing you to take big KOs where you need them. Awakening Drum is also something to consider, though this is a little more for baby Roaring Moon decks, where you get to draw a card for each of your ancient Pokemon in play. Roaring Moon decks kind of play only a handful of them, but this is an option to consider, especially if you're playing the baby Roaring Moon deck. Explorer's Guide is a new supporter card where you get to look at the top 6 cards of your deck and put 2 of them into your hand, and you discard the other cards, helping you grab 2 cards that you need while also getting ancient cards into the discard pile to power up baby Roaring Moon's attack. So really nice addition to the deck there. This first example is about as close to a vanilla list as I could find, where I've got 3 copies of Roaring Moon, 1 Greninja to discard energy and draw 2 cards. We can't attack with Greninja in this build, but there are other ones that I'll show later where you can. 2 copies of the Squawkabilly because we really want to discard our hand that turn 1, get energy into the discard pile, and really just dig through our deck to get to the pieces that we need quickly. 1 copy of Morpeko can be a decent single prize attacker as well, but we are using it as the free pivot in here, especially since there's no Mew EX in this particular build. And we've got 2 copies of the baby Roaring Moon here. And as we can see, we've got the Prime Catcher as a gusting option, along with one copy of Boss's Orders, and then your usual assortment of switch cards. We do have a higher count of Nest Ball to compensate for the lack of Battle VIP Pass. We're not running Buddy Puff in here because we're not playing any small Pokemon outside of Morpeko. And otherwise, pretty standard list here. We've got 3 copies of Pokestop and 1 copy of Collapse Stadium, which I don't hate because it lets you bump the Squawkabilly off of the board. And then 10 energy. Otherwise, this is about as standard issue of a Roaring Moon list that we've seen so far. This list gets a little more spicy with the inclusion of Luminion to grab a supporter from your deck, and Mew EX to help you draw cards, and theoretically you could attack with Mew as well with a whole bunch of switches. You're probably not going to do that, but it is possible. It's mostly here to draw cards. And then on top of that, the big change here is the inclusion of water energy. So with a combination of, say, Sada's Vitalities, you discard a bunch of water energy, Sada's Vitality those in, and then use switching or energy switch cards to then get the energy onto Greninja, and Snipe does give you a little bit more of a different look and maybe a surprise attack as well if your opponent's not expecting the water attack. I kind of flip-flop back and forth on whether or not I like water in Roaring Moon decks. I kind of like the consistency of just straight up dark, but I do love the expanded attack options that can catch your opponent by surprise. I should have noted at the beginning as well that the Japanese deck building style for Roaring Moon appears to be in the more turbo builds that we saw at the beginning of Paradox Rift. They haven't really adopted the sort of slower Roaring Moon style of, say, Ross Cawthorn's top 8 list with the Emergency Jelly and the Professor's Research and Judge. And I think that we will probably see more takes like that once these cards hit internationally. So something to keep in mind here as well as you look at these lists. You're like, hey, how come these are built a little more differently than what we currently have outside of Japan? This third list goes with a 50-50 split of Roaring Moon. So 4 of the Baby Roaring Moon and 4 Roaring Moon EX. Otherwise, the general concept of getting these accelerated quickly and just smashing with the Roaring Moon of choice is pretty much the same. I am very curious about how well this works. I think there are some cool advantages here where you can masquerade as a single prize deck for much of the game with the 4 copies of Roaring Moon, and even with the Super Rod, you could just play straight up Baby Roaring Moon for the whole time, and that could be interesting as well. We also have our first sighting. I don't think we saw the Explorer's Guide card until just now. So yeah, the Explorer card is right here. 3 copies of Pokegear, which is very that's a lot. I'm not sure if I would agree with 3 copies, rather just have other consistency cards in its place, like maybe just extra copies of Professor's Research or something. But I don't hate the inclusion of Roaring Moon here. We still have Prime Catcher, and then 3 copies of Pokestop because we have an item heavy build. We can draw those out with the Pokestop, and 1 copy of the Temple of Sinnoh, which is actually a good inclusion here because there is a new Mist energy which can negate the effect of Frenzied Gouging, and we want to have Frenzied Gouging access. So the Temple of Sinnoh shuts off the Mist energy, lets you Frenzied Gouging through. This last example is the most teched out version of the Roaring Moon list that I was able to find. This one includes a Darkrai and Iron Hands, and yeah, Darkrai, Iron Hands are the big additions here relative to everything else we've seen so far. Just as a quick refresher, Darkrai has the attack Dark Pulse, where for 2 colorless energy it does 30 damage and 30 more damage for each dark energy attached to all of your Pokemon. You're probably not going to be attacking with Darkrai though. For the most part, we're going to be using it for Star Abyss to recover 2 item cards from our discard pile and put them into our hand. Now, we don't have Crossivers here like we saw in that top placing Japanese build, but we can still use Star Abyss to grab pieces like energy switches, earthen vessels, and dark patches, among other things. Iron Hands EX we can power up, kind of like the Greninja in the earlier example, where we use a combination of Sada's vitalities and energy switches in order to power up that amp you very much can help you take multiple prizes against single prize Pokemon, which can be absolutely devastating. There are definitely questions about consistency when we have so many different attack options, your Roaring Moon EX, your Baby Roaring Moon, Darkrai, Iron Hands, even Mew to a certain extent here as well, but very interesting to see. And one other notable card here is the Cryptomaniac's Deciphering card, where it lets you search your deck for 2 cards, shuffle your deck, then put those cards on top in any order. And we are going to stack this with whatever pieces we need to finish our combo and then draw into it with either Mew or Greninja. That concludes our look at Roaring Moon EX. It might not be at the toppity top tier of decks post-rotation, but I still think it's a very strong deck, and if anything, it does get better with the inclusion of Baby Roaring Moon, giving you a single prize attack option that's really good and can potentially even uptrade against multi-prize Pokemon. Again, some caveats with the way these are built. The Japanese style is a little different from the current Western style with the lack of professor's researches and emergency jellies, and I think once the Temporal Forces cards come out internationally, we'll probably see some sort of mix of the 2 styles. And one other note is the inclusion of Mist Energy going forward is going to make things a little weird for Roaring Moon, and maybe teching in a Temple of Sinnoh so that you can still frenzy gouging a Charizard or a Giratina might be the play. So keep that in mind when you are building a post-rotation Roaring Moon deck. But for now, I gotta get going. Thank you so much for watching. You can find me on all the things: YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram at InThirdPerson. You can find me on Twitch at InThirdPerson, where I stream the Pokemon trading card game every Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And check out the website, inthirdperson.com, for more articles and videos on video games, board games, and other nerdy pursuits. I don't know why the graphic is not showing up here. Let's hit the button one more time. Also, apologies for my voice. It's not showing up. All right. Apologies for my voice. I'm battling a cold right now. Please understand. I hope I know I also hit the mic stand there. Let's just get out of here. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.